Regardless of what your religion is, the gigantic impact of the Christianity in the history
Humanity.
of today, there are more than 2 billion Christians on the
Nearly
planet,
a third
of the world's population.
And
anywhere you look, you see clear signs of this presence,
right?
On a cross on the wall,
On a balcony on the table,
a parish on the corner,
a
cathedral in the center of
a
the
street
city,
name,
a pamphlet, a painting, a song,
a statue,
a TV
a video on
series.
YouTube.
Anyway, all this somehow refers to the central figure of Christianity.
Who is
Christ, right? Jesus of. Or at least that's what they say. Because if on the
Historical
one hand, evidence for the existence of Christianity
are
indeed endless, on the other hand, historical evidence of its founder's existence, Jesus, are already much more limited. But they exist. And in this video, we'll take a look at this evidence and analyze how much they are to support the assertion that Jesus of the historical framework really existed. For this,
First,
we will examine the archaeological evidence
directly
linked to Jesus, then the textual evidence, divided into Greco-Roman, Jewish, and Christian. And finally, we will take stock of all this data and assess whether they are indeed conclusive or not. And I find it interesting to start with the evidence,
Archaeological,
which usually this is the kind of evidence that value more tangible evidence. Concrete, solid, like the person's remains, or a tombstone with your name, or the coin with your face, sister-in-law when the person was alive, or something like that. But the problem is, this type of evidence is extremely rare, and when he exists, it's more the case of people from the highest elite in society. What was nowhere near the case of Jesus. And yet, even for elite members, this type of evidence is extremely rare. Until recently, we didn't have any archaeological evidence, for example, that validated the historical existence of Pontius Pilate, who was the most powerful person in Judea. In the times of Jesus, we didn't have any trace of your body, nor from your grave, nor coins with your face, not even with your name, nor statues, nor anything. There is still none of that I mentioned, right? But we have since 1961, few decades ago, a curtain on a wall in the city of maritime Caesarean section, who speaks of such a Pontius Pilate, mayor of Judea, who dedicated the construction, which part of that wall, to such a Tiberius. And as we already had textual evidence that, in fact, there was a prefect from Judea named Pontius Pilate during the rule of an emperor named Tiberius, it's easy to understand this molecule and consider that it really is solid evidence, concrete, of the existence of historic garden. But that's all right. As for the passages on Jesus in the Talmud, obviously, are part of a between Jews and Christians there. Antiquity. In the case of the Thug and Exu, in fact, we are the already in the Middle Ages, right? From the 9th century. The one changes this for is sure the only before that, archaeological but it's hard to date each of its parts very accurately in this a text collection that has been gaining its current form mainly between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Both sources are very late and consequently one very small probability of faithfully recording directly connected to Pilate. But if that's the way it is, why am I bringing these sources here? It is possible that they register, yes, some really ancient traditions about Jesus. Said that Jesus was the son of a panther, something that Celso, as we saw in the 2nd century, and again right, also said. And this change said that Jesus learned sorcery in the, which is another thing that we also find in Celso. That these Jewish sources have been based directly on text from the Rumang Doctor of Celsus, because there are many divergences also between them. We are talking about authority here. Says that the mother of Jesus made her living said she was a hairdresser. Celso said that Panther, the father of Jesus, was a Ramhan soldier or tolerator, and Exu already said that Panther was a Jew of the tribe of Judah. So like this, it is much more likely maximum that both of the how much these Jewish sources have been based on ante-oral traditions, very old. And however set these sources may be, the Jewish opposition Christianity frequently passed for one defamation when Jesus supposedly existed, questioning its historical existence that Jesus was one bad person. For example, they at least say that Jesus was one good person. That we are talking about sources says here without considering the main sources about Jesus. What is the new will? Now imagine then, the sources that the Christians wrote in favor of their tradition. Often when asked about the sources that exist to test the historical existence of Jesus, the tendency is to answer how do we start the video? Doing this with sources that are outside the goal of intelligence, or at least the new will, or what would be painful to expect. More precisely in this case, to promote Christianity, raise the importance of Jesus to the fullest. Consequently, the texts of the New Testament cannot be read as historical and impartial, nor They have one very clear side to this story. Does not mean, in terms of evidence, that these texts are useless for historical research. That no source is completely neutral and unbiased, nor those who entered the tomb, nor those left outside of it. Each and every author has their own biases. Right. Before a wrong text, what historians do is not throw the text away without immediately accepting everything he says, but considering the possibility there of each point in the text, whether compared to other evidence that we have. And that's what historians do when reading the New Will, they do or when any reading other source, neither. About a peasant before making a final assessment about the historical evidence of Jesus, it is worth us to give at least a quick look here in some Christian texts. And we can start to do this with Paul's letters, which are the oldest texts we have of the most remote interior of this tribe. Of the 27 books of the New Will, 13 of these letters attributed to the Apostle Most Paul. Historians consider that at least 7 cards were certainly written by Paul. 3 letters maybe were written by him, and 3 letters most likely were not written by him are false assignments, nor from the Judean Bible. So for us to stay in firmer territory, I'm going to refer only to what's in the 7 letters as authentic, nor that date around there of the 50s of the 1st century. In these letters, Paul refers to Jesus unquestionably like having been a man of flesh and blood, born of a woman. So survivals, had brothers, made disciples, was brought to trial by Jews from the tribe of Judea, was executed by Paul himself admits that he writes known Jesus supposedly had known Jesus when he was alive. Hollow records, also archaeological situations with Peter and other apostles who lived with Jesus, and also that he was with James, one brother of Jesus, and all these people were supposed to be alive was writing these letters. Then still, that one can disagree with the vision that Paul had from Jesus, that he was indeed the Son of, we really have nothing, God, someone who rose from the dead, and that will come again. To end the story, it's hard to imagine that he was wrong, right? The fact that Jesus, for example, had a living brother who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, Paul did his just activities like us in his preaching, and that it was even a figure on which Paul seems to have disagreed on many points. So like this, if Paul had invented Jesus, would he adopt one brother for him who was alive and who was at a certain level to an opponent of Paul? Circumstantial investigation has no archaeological evidence. And of course, Paul is not the only author who talks about Jesus, his disciples, and his family, right? Actually, this is not even the primary objective of the story. Much more with hormonal and church organization, and a matter of the texts of the New Will, directly connected. Who are primarily interested in telling the story of Jesus are the Gospels. And those give even more clues to the issues that we are addressing to be a little later Paul's than letters. They are usually dated from the 70s to the 90s, is practically none. A few historians place the Gospels well before. Not 40 years. What would make him the oldest source about Jesus? Until the letters of Paul and a few other historians put other Gospels, like the Gospel of Luke, after the year 100. Of your companions and countrymen, these dating is always very the originals of none of these texts, nor what again is nothing surprising. We also don't have the ancient history, nor Pliny's letters, nor of the lives of Suetonio, nor of the antiquities of Joseph, nor of such change, including much richer people there, nor practically nothing. The oldest existing edition of key rings is the Germanic manuscript produced in the 19th century of the 9th century. But even though we don't have the originals, it is possible to know that these texts are much older by the fact that they, and politically influential than he, are cited in previous documents, and also by analyzing his style, of your vocabulary, of the historical references it makes, of the context he assumes you are known by your readers, and so on. There are several ways to date one text without having the originals. No, sometimes more precisely, sometimes not so much. So, and only in front
In
right.
the case of the Gospels,
The oldest material
that
evidence
we have from one of them,
it's a tiny fragment, with parts of the Gospel
dating
of John
from
the beginning of the 2nd century.
So this Gospel certainly predates this need,
but it's hard to say
for sure how old.
We will
And to
focus throughout
complicate
this
the
situation
situation
it is
more.
possible to clearly perceive that the Gospels
Our texts
the
that were
Gospel
based
says
on
this
previous
explicitly,
sources.
right? It starts with the following
Since many
words,
have already tried to
a narration
compose
of the facts that followed between
as those
us,
who,
more in written
from the
sources
beginning,
even, were eyewitnesses and ministers of the
seemed
word.
convenient to me too.
After the cured investigation of everything from the
Write you
beginning,
in order,
illustrious Theophilus,
so that,
discover the
but
soundness
even
of
more
the teachings
interesting,
you have received,
that this explicit evidence
actually, to sources before the Gospels
are the implicit evidence.
To give just one example here, which I think is one of the most interesting examples.
In the Gospel of Luke,
Jesus appears criticizing a group of Jews
for
them giving the mint tithe of rue and
but
all
leave
vegetables,
aside justice and God's love.
and in the Gospel of Matthew, before going to written sources, there is a very
which
similar
Jesus
passage,
makes the
but
same
here he says
critique
dill instead
and
of
says
aruga.
mercy
These
and
variations may
faithfulness instead of
seem
God's
somewhat
love.
irrelevant at first sight, but there's something very interesting behind them, is that the words digger and rust and
practically
love
identical
and mercy
and
can be confused very easily. Yes, with each other means right. In Portuguese, obviously they don't look
And not in
anything
Greek.
like each other.
What is the original language of these
They
Gospels?
also don't look anything like each other. But in Aramaic, which was the language spoken in the region that Jesus would have
They
lived,
are practically identical.
Archaeological
And this
evidence
suggests
in all likelihood then
that this story
of the
used by
Gospels
the
of Luke
authors
and Matthew came from an earlier source in Aramaic, and that at some point in the transmission of that source, one little mess has happened. And these two variants have appeared. And there are several other cases similar
And cases
to these,
also
right?
that parable
Just makes sense. Which is what comes closest to
when
being
they are
something
retranslated
solid,
into
even
Aramaic.
though the Gospels are only
About
4
Jesus.
first-century sources.
In fact, it would
by
be
the
quite
standards
right.
of ancient history, they give many
Even
clues
earlier
that ended
other
up not
sources
reaching us
surviving the
right. Good weather and concrete about Jesus. And finally, we could also cite
Which came
other
out.
Christian sources. Record ancient traditions about
That does
Jesus
not appear in
like
the
the
New
Apocryphal
Apocryphal
Gospels. Or Christian authors who wrote at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd
century,
time to time appears in
as is the
discussion
case of the Roman
Ignatius of
Clement.
Antioch and the popes of Hierapolis.
But then we already start
to move a little further away of the times when Jesus would have lived, and whether the arguments from Paul
are not
and the
considered
evangelists
convincing
arguments
enough
from Christian authors
after them.
won't be either. About the historical existence of this heritage. So I think we can already hear forward to the conclusion of this whole story. And then, Jesus existed or did not exist. Evidence is sufficient. And then the answer is, depends on what each one considers
Comparing.
sufficient, right? With what is expected in the field
The
of
evidence
ancient
presented
history, that's this
here
box you're seeing, are more than enough to
Perfectly
consider
possible
possible
that a man
in the
named
time
Jesus,
of Pilate, who made
has
disciples
indeed
and was
existed.
executed. The overwhelming majority of
atheists,
historians,
Christian
Jews, Muslims, or of any belief or
Believe in
disbelief,
the historical
this
existence
object
of
there is a
Jesus.
user. That means it's absolutely proven. So, with 100% certainty,
Means
that
only
Jesus did not exist. That the level of plausibility of Jesus' existence is too high. 100% certainty cannot have about the existence of any poison. From the times of Jesus, maybe no Tiberian emperor
Maybe his
existed.
status
and coins are a scam, which is a bone container.
The texts that
are
quote
manufactured
this emperor
or
impossible to
interpolated
prove with
the Tiberian
100%
emperor
certainty.
does not. Was the production there of and of the
So
past?
yes,
it is possible
but
to
it is
raise this
reasonable to
hypothesis.
raise this
We hear about
hypothesis.
the proof pattern, typical of first-century Jewish. Beyond reasonable doubt, right?
I mean,
something can be considered proven, although there are still doubts about
Because
the
just
question.
like in
in
legal
history,
case,
there will always be room for some doubt. The question is, this doubt is reasonable,
is flexible.
Consider insufficient. He was found in 2002. Historical evidence for the existence of Jesus, and at the same time, Consider sufficient historical evidence for the existence of Socrates. For example, which is cited by only 3 contemporary authors, has no archaeological evidence connected directly to it. Or even worse, right? And what makes him special? No case of tagging. Pythagoras is not mentioned by no foreign source, nor archaeological, nor textual. None. 0. And yet, there are not so many people who doubt the existence of Socrates. Among the various other users, right? More Pythagoras. At least he's a more incredible character than Jesus. No one said he worked extravagant things escape our scientific knowledge, nor naturalist. But that's not true, right? The ancient texts we have about Pythagoras that we have from this context, that it was something that Apollo also said that he was the child of God with the help of a mysterious cloud, that he had access to the world of the dead, and that it was seen by people in different places. And maybe here at this point, rule out the existence of Pythagoras too. Alexander the Great is a tribe in Aramaic of Alexander the Great. We have several statues, coins, inscriptions, and numbers. Painful testimonies written about him from different regions and peoples. This is a poison that question its existence. There really is no one left Alexander in ancient history. Some ancient authors say that appears that on one side of him. Others say that he was carried by 2 griffins to the highest sky, and until the such changes from above says extraordinary things about Alexander. Saying, for example, that he visited the Garden of Eden, which says the following. It means then that Alexander the Great cannot have been a historic Alexander. Of course not. The fact that things absolutely legendary, extraordinary, or mythical be attributed to certain figures does not mean that they did not exist. It may simply be Yaakov Bar and Osiph Sharp and Exua that the biography of these characters have been exaggerated, embellished, and even sacralized by people who love to say that there was a historical Jesus, sources are enough to support this. Does not mean in any way say that history confirms the new will be. That would be the ossuary of James, or that history confirms that Jesus resurrected or cured illnesses. What historical is much more accessible, not by chance the historians who respond yes with all conviction. The question about the existence of Jesus give son of Joseph. When we move on to the who then he was exactly, right? What exactly did he do? What exactly did he say? I will leave it in this video. For now, it's just that, right? This is a quick introduction to question about the existence of Jesus, brother of Jesus, and not about who Jesus was effectively. Then about the existence of Jesus. Answer down there in the comments as well if you have any more formed opinion about it. If you consider that yes, Jesus exists or not. You are not convinced and so that this is true. We can continue this conversation in the comments. How is this user? The main references consulted for this video, so they're in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Dating from the even first century after Christ, and it brings these 3 associated names, Joseph and Jesus. Many people suspect that he could be Tiago's user, called James the Just, which is continues, who appears in the Bible and son of Joseph, Jesus. Consequently, we would have there evidence, concrete existence of a brother or of that Jesus. Indirectly, it would be evidence of the existence of Jesus himself. It's not impossible, but it's not quite right either, because it's a series of details that we have to consider there. In this story, the first detail is that these Joseph and Jesus names James are among the most common to that context, 240, and 7 male and female names that appear in users in the region. 19 are Joseph and 10 are James. These 2 names are users' most common male names. Other documents from the period. One study pointed out that 14% of all Jewish names in this context were variations. Joseph's Aramaic, neither Yosef or Yahaseth 9% were variations of Jesus, and 12% were James, born Yaakov. And here we can paint Yaakovs like James or origin Jacob of the name is, same as I already explained these numbers here on the channel. Historian Andre Lemur, who was responsible for this study, came to the conclusion in this period of Roman domination in Judea, in which Jesus would have lived, there could have been about 20 men called James, who were sons of some Joseph and brothers of some Jesus. And there is still a second detail about this evidence, the user of Tiago, which is as follows. Despite the user being dated very securely, and this by various forms of hydration, chemical hydration, the cell that appears in the user may not be original. For a while, collector, who owns this object, reached up to 44 forgery cases, including when a lawsuit because of the user of James for the first time to a board of experts. They even came to the conclusion that grandma was a fake. More recently, a new examination favorable to the authenticity of the inscription. But be that as it may, is even if the appearance is authentic, and this second panel of experts, that the first meeting of specialists can't tell if these Tiago, Joseph and Jesus appearing in the Bible are exactly the Tiago Joseph and Jesus were looking for. And this is just one example of how precarious may be the archaeological evidence, no matter how solid and palpable they are. In the end, what commands is not so much the interpretation of this object, and this interpretation depends on many other information that we find in other types of sources that are extremely important to history. What are the written sources? And it's for them so we go now. The oldest sources, more informative and more numerous, that we have about Jesus are the sources written by Christians. But obviously, followers of Jesus will say that Jesus exists in these other authors, let's see, nor non-Christians that give clues to the existence of Jesus. And we can start with the Romans, and among the Romans, first, lie. We can talk about Pliny Caius, the Caecilian Plinius, second, better known as Pliny. The young man was a Roman senator and jurist who occupied several imperial positions. What most interests us here is that Pliny was appointed governor of California. Between the years 111 and this period, 100 with the many letters. Trajan, telling him what was happening there in the region, asking for guidance on with how more to specific deal questions. One of those letters, which is letter 96, the oldest record that the people have today, from a Roman source mentioning explicitly the figure of Jesus, and the context of the letter is the following. Currently receiving multiple complaints against the presence and activity of his Christians in, and he didn't quite know how to deal with this new contagious spread, how he refers to Christianity. He tells the emperor that until then, whenever someone was brought to him, he forced one to worship images of the emperor and other gods, and making offerings to these gods and insulting Christ. If the person was willing to do this, she was released and otherwise. In addition, it also records that Christians always said, who had not committed any crime, to be brought to trial, and that its activities were simply hold in which they sang hymns to Christ, almost like a god. And it's basically this that Pliny then says in his letter, right? And Trajan, the emperor, replied a letter saying he had no schooling, very specific about this issue. But he advises Pliny not to actively seek out Christians, nor accept anonymous complaints. More, in case someone took one Christian to trial, right? Simply because I am a Christian, this accused should be forced to retract, worshiping or the Roman gods, right? And we can get a lot of interesting information. So from these letters, first, become evident Christianity was already a well-developed phenomenon there of the 2nd century, to the point of arriving in Asia Minor. Where was the Bithynia cloud? And it's about to make a big impact to motivate a governor to send a letter to the emperor, to know how to deal with the
Another
situation
thing is that we
also
can
in these
already
letters
see
that Christianity was detested by the population of empire and was effectively pursued, at least occasionally.
neither.
And third and most important, for the question of the historical
this letter
existence
also
of Jesus
suggests
that, in this early stage of Christianity, Christ was worshipped almost like a god. At least these are the words
This
that
one is
Pliny
almost
records,
very interesting,
because it implies that,
and that
Christ
he received
received
worship.
most high honors. But it wasn't seen exactly right. Effectively, as one being of the same type as
He was
Zeus
probably
or
one
Apollo.
man.
Someone who had really existed in
But
the
he was
flesh.
not
He was
treated
again
like
a
a
mere
right.
mortal, almost a god. But not exactly. This testimony of Pliny
That
comes there from his relationship with Christians
that he carried right
and received
is
at least
already
on starting
trial.
to offer some parts for our puzzle, but there are still
He
very
does
few
not say
pieces. Nothing, for example, about the origin
what
of
he
Christ
did.
or what they did to him, what he said. Simply is that there was a movement that worshipped this
Only
Christ
some of these
that we don't
things.
find in Pliny. We can indeed find in thirds left by other of your companions, such as Sueton, Publia or Gaius Cornelius
Tacitus
was a Roman senator who also held a number of imperial positions, and during its
He wrote
public
two
performance,
very
important historical works,
which
are the stories that cover the period that will give death to Nero until the death of Domitian, and the annals that go back to the times of
Advanced in
Tiberius.
Nero's
In this
government.
last book, dating from around
There
the
is an
year
account of the
120,
famous fire
in Rome. He says this
That would have
fire
happened in July 64,
was attributed by part of the
but
population
Nero,
to
to get
Emperor
rid
Nero.
of
This
this
popular accusation blamed it on a group that was hated in the
whom
city,
the
crowd called Christians, or better, of Christians. The text says
Black.
this: found guilty and
Those
punished
hated
in
for their
unusual
shameful
ways,
acts,
whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of that name, Christ, had been executed in the kingdom
by
of
attorney
Tiberius
Pontio
Pilatus, suppressed for a while this deadlition right Christianity, and broke again, not just in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all the terrible
from
and shameful
everywhere
things meet and become popular. This document not only says a lot about early Christianity, but also says very important things about the figure of Christ. Key records that Christ lived in the times of Tiberius, who was emperor between 14
also
and
says
37. That he was executed under Pilate, governor of Judea, and said the movement that Christ started in Judea was already present in Rome,
where it was
in the year
considered
60
by
many
many
to
right,
be a bad, i.e., occult and legitimate. Okay, if you wrote those words at the beginning of the 2nd century, and certainly was no direct witness to almost any of this. Even if, for some reason, two people does not want to fully accept the key yet testimony,
some things that are undeniable.
the first of these is that Christianity was, without a doubt, known in Rome in the early 2nd century. That was when Tacitus was writing. The second is that, at least, it was plausible to, and his Christianity was already known in the middle of the 1st century, right, in the times of the
In
Great
64
Fire of
and
Rome,
third,
that this movement of Christians was attributed to a founding
Call of
figure
Christ,
who was described
a
as
man
a
of
man
flesh and
executed
blood
by
from
the
the
Roman
tribe of
authority
Judea.
around the year 30, and about the term Christian's knee. Just so you don't leave
This
it
is a
too
spelling
much
that
in the air.
appears in
Ridges or
several
ridges
ancient
was a
thirds.
Greco-Roman proper name, which came from an adjective that meant good or useful. This name is very similar to the title Christ, which is a Greek word meaning anointed right, and translates the Hebrew term Machia, or because of this many non-authors neither, who were not familiar with Jewish messianism, nor with Christian theology, who confused this with title Christ's proper name frequently. A 4th century Christian, for example, arrived until you register your with this mistake of people that he calls this confusion, another including old source about Jesus, who also makes this confusion right of credits with Christ. It's Gay Suetonio, Quiet Suetonios, was also one Roman author who lived at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century and left a very important life of work. The 12s. This work brings the biographies of
Since
Roman
July
rulers
until Domitian,
and in the midst of this, in the biography
who
of
reigned
Emperor
between
Claudius,
40 and 154,
we find another reference to crests, which is as follows. He, Claudius, not the emperor, expelled the Jews from Rome, for they were always causing disturbances, because of the instigator.
Ridges.
Like
As I
ridges.
already said,
it wasn't a name like a Jew, but rather a name like
it is
the Greek
unlikely that the
Rama
crest quoted
be
here
some
in this
Jew,
passage,
and also unlikely that the instigator
behind a disturbance between Jews,
was a non-Jew. Most historians today understands that this passage
took place
refers
among
to
Jews
disputes
around the figure
that some
of Jesus,
accepted as the king, nor Christ,
but
most rejected it as idolatry, right?
as a man worshipped there
And
in
these
God's
frictions
place
then
who
were
were
starting
starting
to
to
become Christians there, and the Jews were rejecting Christianity, may have climbed to a point in that Claudius decided to avoid the possibility of more violent conflicts develop there. And the other passage in the lives
which
of the
also
12,
refers
and this
to
is
Christianity,
unquestionably,
which
it
is that
refers to
during
Nero's
Christianity
biography. He says the following: punishments were
class
applied to Christians of people linked to a perverse
This
sentence appears in a session. They're from the text
in
of
which he is
Suetonio,
listing
Nero's positive actions.
Then,
the Suetonio himself criticizes Nero a lot in
but he
various
praises
actions
the fact
that
Nero have pursued
it is
Christians
possible
there,
that these punishments
have some relation
here
to
the great fire of Rome, right? Cited by the, but the author
and
does
a
not
horrible
make this
thing.
clear. What is Suetonio
Writes
in this
Christians with
passage?
I say
"ni," and not with "and," which led some historians to question, because he would have written crests and not Christ in the first
If
passage. A crest instigator was in fact a founder of Christianity. That it is perfectly possible that the Sueton, who only make these two
Very
references,
short to
did not
Christianity
know
in
the
his
movement
work.
very well, and consequently
he missed the connection between
Christian
these terms.
crests and Christians.
But
anyway, this is one more source that points out for significant presence. There are Christians in
Rome,
the first century, at least Ali during Nero's rule, and if we understand that the crest instigator is, in fact, to Christ, to Jesus, so this source points to the existence of Christianity in the first half of the first century, during Claudius' time there. And those are the three main ancient sources, Greek Roman, about Christianity and about
Before
Christ,
moving
on to Jewish sources that are very interesting. It's also worth talking about quickly from two other Greco-Roman sources, but who also say very funny things
The
about
first of
Jesus.
these
Called
is a
The Death of
satirical
a Pilgrim,
text
by Luciano da Samasa.
It's
around the year 165.
In this text,
Luciano
who
associated
story
himself
of a man
Christians
called
as
the
Palestine,
Pilgrims,
and soon dominated
Pilgrim,
the community. Still, according to Luciano, explained and commented on some
and even
sacred
wrote
texts.
some.
Christians took him as a prophet, chief leader of the synagogue, and even as a
He
god.
just wasn't
worshipped
then
anymore
a man
by
from
Christians,
Palestine,
who was crucified for bringing this new form of initiation to the world. Like I said, it's satire, right? He does not propose himself at all to be a reliable historical document, and its main objective is, actually, make fun of the figure of a Perio pilgrim that he was of Luciano, and passing through, make fun of Christianity
born
that
too,
Luciano considered as being the accumulation
about
of.
this.
It even says in the text the following, right? That Christians have convinced themselves that they
Immortal,
are and will live, that they
forever,
despise death and surrender to her willingly, and that they love that crucified
taught them
surfer.
to
deny the Greek gods and all that. Christians would be accepted only by faith, without any evidence. So still according to Luciano, if one fraudulent and cunning person knows how to take
among
advantage of the
Christians
situation comes among them, this person can get rich in a short time, while laughing at these silly people. And new right. This is one fictional text, but it's one fictional text that is commenting beyond second-century reality, regardless of merits or demerits. Of Lucian's opinion on
The fact
Christianity,
is,
this text serves as yet another testimony of tradition that Christianity would have emerged from someone's teachings of a man of flesh and blood, testimony to this man's the Christians were also being executed in the times because of their beliefs and their way of life. Good. And finally, to close the main sources, Greek. We have a slightly later source The Life of a Pilgrim, which is a treatise
Written
by
by
Celso,
Celso,
a true
Neo-Platonist
Platonist physician and philosopher.
This work is also contrary to
but it
Christianity.
is very different from Luciano's
He does not
text,
propose
but an
to be
accusation,
satire,
even against the foundations of Christianity,
such as
your antiquity, his curiosity, its morality, and
its
its in this
authenticity,
context of
that
accusations
Celsus will
then
say a
would
number
be
of
harmful
things
there
about
to
Jesus.
Christianity. For example, that Jesus was the son
What
of a
would be a
poor
demerit
peasant
there?
girl. In Celsus' view of the founder of
He
Christianity,
also said
that this poor peasant girl got pregnant with Jesus
in an
to
adultery
hide
with
the
this.
Roman soldier named Panther. Jesus would have made up
He
the
was
story
born of a
that
virgin.
Partus in Greek, a word reminiscent of
In
Panther.
addition,
The Celsus
were
said
actually
that as
sorceries
Jesus was
learned in
very
Egypt.
proud of
He
these
learned in
powers.
Egypt.
He gave himself the title
As much
of
as
God.
this source has such a
Clearly
bias,
nor. It is interesting
Celso
to
raises
note
the
that at no
possibility of
time
Jesus
have not existed.
What does he actually do?
Is to offer other explanations for the positive claims
So,
of
for
Christians.
example,
He said Jesus had power, yes,
but it was Egyptian
he said there
sorcery.
was. Yes, the rumor that Jesus was born of a virgin,
But that was
and
to
he also
stifle
said
your
that
mother's
people
adultery.
considered, yes, that Jesus was God.
But that was
a raving rumor in the truth, and a proud rumor that Jesus himself
i.e.,
would have created. Despite turning
the heavens
Christianity
seemed to doubt
upside
at no
down,
time
that the traditions about Jesus had
on a
some
real person,
historical knee of flesh and blood.
Well,
And those are 5 important
Greek
sources
Roman
then
about
ancient
Jesus.
Christianity. But as I already anticipated,
these are not the only sources
that we have
the
to
question of the
evaluate.
historicity
There are
of
also
Jesus
very interesting
that we
Jewish
can
sources
and should
The
consider
first
from
of
now
these
on,
sources may be the
not
main
on this
source
topic,
right, of the historical existence of Jesus.
Who is
the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus? Josephus was actually born
and even
Iosif
led
ben Mattatiaro Jewish forces against the Romans in Galilee. The context of the Jewish-Roman Wars. After surrendering and being arrested by his opponents, Iosif started to collaborate
and
with
adopted
them.
the Roman name
At this
Flavios
stage, he
and
accepted the
Ossiphos,
patronage of the imperial family
and
began to write a historical work about the war in which he had just participated, which was published as
This
the War
around
of
the
the Year
Jews.
75. After that, he even wrote a second work, very important, Call of Jewish Antiquities,
that tells
the
the
story
Adam
of
and
the
Eve
Jewish
to the
people
revolt
against Rome. And it is in this last work, nor in Jewish Antiquities, published around the year 94, that he makes 2 very important references about Jesus, and it's worth starting, actually, by the second reference, which is made in the book 20 of Antiquities, which is shorter and less controversial than the first. So we already kill faster this second reference. What this second reference says is that a high priest, during a gap in the period of Roman administration in the province of Judea, that there in the 60s, gathered the judges brought before him the brother of Jesus named whose name was James, and some others. After accusing them of lawbreakers, he and high priest gave them to be stoned. Evidence about a man from Judea who was called Christ, and that he had a brother named James who was stoned in the 60s. And we have an independent source from the 2nd century, which also says that James, the brother of Jesus who appears there, was stoned during this period, in the 60s. So it's very likely that this historical character quoted by Joseph, neither Jesus called Christ, brother of Tiago, be the same Jesus there from the New Will, Jesus worshipped by Christians, and not Jesus literally. And while this is the second reference then, that Joseph does to Jesus really short, but it has an earlier reference Jewish to the one Antiquities, which is much stronger, right? Much more detailed than this. So strong, as detailed even, which is considered to be highly suspicious. This first reference of the Jewish Antiquities, and is known in the debate this question of the existence of Jesus as the Flavian testimony, the testimony of Flavius Josephus, and that it is worth mentioning what the Joseph says in the Bible lived. A wise man, if it is indeed correct, call him a man, because he performed and was a master deeds, to people who accepted thee with pleasure. He conquered many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Pilates, when he heard himself condemned him to the cross, but those who had initially loved him They didn't stop loving him. On the third day he appeared to them again alive, because the divine prophets had prophesied and countless other things about him. To this day, did not the tribe of Christians called by their name. If we were to accept the full authenticity of this document, we would have a first-century Jew there, born and raised in Judea, testifying that Jesus existed, that he was a man, that he was recognized as a miracle maker, and even more right, that Jesus would have been denounced by Jewish leaders and executed for crucifixion by the Roman authorities, and that after that he would have been seen, resurrected, and would have left a large number of Jewish followers, which fits a lot right with the new will. The problem is that this testimony beats so much with Christian writings, which appears to be in fact a Christian writing, at least in some parts. For example, no, the text says that Jesus was the. He didn't say they said Jesus was the, but that he was really the. And one such statement, it would only make Christianity sense if Josephus had joined the, which is something, is not collaborated by any other point in his works, other excerpts, as if it is or indeed did he appear to them again alive, or still, the divine prophets had prophesied over him. Also Josephus should have become a Christian, right? And here it is important to say that we do not have, unfortunately, the originals of this text to see if these passages, if these statements were originally there, as of the Flavian testimony, were produced and preserved by Christians in the 4th century. And it is significant that Christians of the 2nd and 7th have never referenced, not even in their apologetic tried to offer as much as possible evidence in favor. It's hard to believe that passage already existed in this way. So of this pass. Today, most historians consider was not written, at least not entirely by Joseph, but by Christian scribes during the text copying and reproduction process. As I already anticipated, it doesn't mean that the whole passage is a fabrication. Much of the text has the style and vocabulary of Joseph, and fits very well in the general context of the work. So what many historians propose is that a more neutral passage have actually been written subsequently by Joseph. This passage ended up receiving interpolations, and this more neutral passage, it would be something more. At that time Jesus lived, a wise man, because he performed amazing deeds and was a master to people who gladly accepted many Jews and many Greeks. When he heard himself accused by the leaders among us to the cross, but those who had initially they didn't stop loving him. To this day, the doctrine of Christians called by that name, so neither. If that core is at least considered authentic, nor the testimony of Joseph in Judea, nor can you have early stages of development of Christianity remains a very important to this question of the historicity of Jesus, even if we exclude it. Those most problematic beyond Josepho. We also have other texts by ancient Jews. They all have the same problem. But let's see the text first, and then we discuss these other texts, which are Talmud and Toldot. The Talmud is a collection of rabbinic thirds that were written and gathered to Jewish traditions after the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of the Jews. In the context there of the Roman Jewish wars, we have some mentions of extraordinary things and ended up only being these mentions are not is one stretch. For example, says like this: was taught on the eve of Passover, hanged and exu. A herald went before him for 40 days. He will be stoned because he practiced magic and induced anyone who knows anything come ahead and beg for him. But nothing has been found in your favor. And they hanged him on the eve of Passover. Another document that is the tolerant and also brings some statements of this was a sorcerer who violated Jewish laws and ended up being hanged because of it. He also said that Jesus was born from an extra relationship between they and a man called a panther. Says he self-ed himself as that he performed many miracles using unduly the letters of the ineffable name and of that God. His disciples to say he tried to hide his body, ascended to heaven. Both this tolerant and exu